So let me start this morning with a bit of a health warning. I suspect I am one of the least well qualified people to preach this particular sermon, but let me do the best that I can. Let me explain. In terms of my understanding of science, these days I am perhaps at best an interested noodler, a dabbler when I have the time and the inclination. And in terms more specifically of my knowledge of physics, well, I got an A at O level, but that was in 1985. And it was the old sort of physics, good for calculating the speed at which a block might slide down an angled plane. All very helpful. And in terms of what is called the new physics, quantum physics or quantum mechanics, I am frankly pretty hopeless. I do, as an aside, have a first cousin who is a professor of quantum physics at Bristol University. But the reality is that he got the science brain and I got the history brain. And net, incidentally, I'm still pretty happy with that particular outcome. But it's funny, the more I noodle, the more I dabble in the staggering advances in contemporary science, the more I feel that I ought to have a better understanding of it. And the more I feel the need for us all to grapple with it, much as we grapple with aspects of our own faith. Because the sense that I get is that the gap seems to be closing more and more between science and faith. That gap which grew with humanity's growing sense of modernity, expressed in the stark rationalism of the Enlightenment, seems to me to be closing once again. At one level, science seems to find itself looking in the direction of God because of the deep, intelligible order that it encounters in the universe. Scientists increasingly detect an extraordinary mathematical beauty about the deep structures of reality. Science is increasingly pointing to God as it seeks to grapple with the nature of the universe. In the words of Albert Einstein, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. That speaks both to the intricate structure and order that exists throughout creation, but also the miracle that is our own human consciousness that can increasingly make sense of how it all works. Professor Paul Davies is one of the leading theorists in this field, and as long ago as 1983 wrote what is probably the best known book on this subject, God and the New Physics. I'm working my way through it. It's challenging stuff at times, although he does a great job at making these incredibly complex theories intelligible, even for someone like me. Professor Davies writes, if the universe is simply an accident, the odds against it containing any appreciable order are ludicrously small. It appears hard to escape the conclusion that the actual state of the universe has been chosen or selected somehow from the huge number of available states, all but an infinitesimal fraction of which are totally disordered. And, he says, if such an exceedingly improbable initial state was selected, there surely had to be a selector or designer to choose it. Or in other words, the ordered nature of the universe points to a creator God. The laws of nature are so precisely fine-tuned that the smallest variation in any direction would have excluded human life. This applies to the universal forces of gravity, electromagnetism, the speed of light, nuclear forces, and much, much more. For example, if the universe had expanded in the first few minutes of the Big Bang minutely slower than it did, the universe would have collapsed in on itself. Any faster, and it would have precluded the existence of life. A change in the resonant energy of just 0.0001% in our stars would have resulted in the complete absence of carbon in our universe, and therefore no carbon-based life, including, obviously, ourselves. In the words of British astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, nothing has shaken my atheism as much as this discovery. And in the words of perhaps the most influential theoretical physicist of his generation, Sir Stephen Hawking, the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications. And of course, all that is before we get to some of the more mind-blowing discoveries in the field of quantum physics, the realm of atoms, electrons, photons, and more than 200 other subatomic particles. Without going into a great deal of detail, for which I lack the time and, yes, the expertise, these subatomic particles are packets of energy, probabilities of existence that only come into physical existence in our 4 dimensions of time and space when we observe them. And when we withdraw our observation, they rather remarkably lose their physical characteristics and revert to being waves of energy. Quantum physics points to a deep sense of interrelationship and connectedness at the most fundamental level across the universe. Scientists have observed the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, in which 2 subatomic particles are connected in such a way that a change to one is instantly reflected in the other, even if the 2 particles are at opposite sides of the universe. It's an observed reality that Richard Rohr has suggested hints at a universe where everything is in relationship, in communion. He goes on to say, prayer, intercession, healing, love and hate, heaven and hell, all make sense on a whole new level. Religion has long pointed to this entanglement. And so gradually, year by year, decade by decade, science is grappling with and increasingly making sense of the things that humans have intuited spiritually throughout the centuries. In the words of Richard Rohr again, we have a new language for what we have always believed. It's a perspective, I think, that should provide us with renewed confidence as Christians in the face of what often feels a militant atheism. We must remember and remind that atheism, like Christianity, requires an act of faith. There is no evidence whatsoever for the non-existence of God. And there is plenty of evidence, and arguably growing scientific evidence, for God's existence. But what I hear you say has that all got to do with our readings from Luke and Acts this morning? How can all that help us as an Easter people? Well, the resurrection is without doubt the fundamental tenet of our faith. Without the resurrection, the rest of Christianity falls away like a house of cards. And of course, the criticism that is so often levelled at our faith is that the resurrection couldn't possibly have happened. It is mere superstition in the face of the observable reality of the known universe. Because this morning's reading, and indeed much of our post-Easter lectionary, is pretty mind-bending too. But it's also incredibly detailed and specific in its testimony. Luke is very clear in what he's communicating about these events. This is a very physical, bodily resurrection. Real flesh and bone, no phantasm, no ghost. Jesus appears, he disappears, he ascends, but he is flesh and bone, muscle and sinew. Able, as Luke makes very clear, to eat that piece of baked fish. His body is real. It bears the marks of his crucifixion, and yet is somehow hard to recognize at times by those who knew him best. His body is somehow transfigured. It's a resurrection that points to our own future bodily resurrection, not as a simple life after death or going to heaven, but a new embodied life in God's new world. A life after death, as Tom Wright puts it. And as Tom Wright goes on to say, the new body, our new bodies, will belong in both the dimensions of God's world, in both heaven and earth. And if our mental pictures of heaven need adjusting to allow for this startling possibility, he says, so be it. But of course, the risk is that in this post-Enlightenment, aggressively rational and proof-thirsty world, we are gulled into thinking of these resurrection events as, at best, supernatural, and at worst, superstitious. As modern Christians, we are placed in an incredibly awkward position. We can acknowledge these miraculous events as something somehow supernatural and risk losing our credibility in this rational society of ours. Or we perform some liberal theological gymnastics to explain how and why the disciples thought they saw the things they saw. Or perhaps even worse, we can seek to downplay these events altogether and as a result relegate Jesus into some sort of philosopher prophet rather than the saviour of our world. But perhaps there's another way. And perhaps it has to do with the new physics and this developing convergence between science and faith. Increasingly, we Easter people must regard these resurrection events, however singular and significant, as part of nature. Not supernatural, but part of a natural universe that we have yet to fully understand. And a set of events which are increasingly credible in the light of the new and emerging physics, which portrays a universe not only of intentional design, but of an interconnection and dimensionality that we are only now beginning to understand. It is, of course, part of the hubris that underlies our humankind, that we are forever modern, seemingly always as a species at the peak of our powers, at the very zenith of our knowledge and ability. But let's just remember that less than 400 years ago, Galileo was tried for heresy for claiming that the earth was round. We're only 200 years from the belief that travelling at more than 20 miles an hour would result in delirium furiosum, an irreversible madness. In the words of American screenwriter and director Randall Wallace, the creator of Braveheart, our knowledge is finite, while our ignorance is unbounded. What scientific understanding will we have 200 years from now? Or 400 years from now? We cannot begin to imagine. But I would bet that it will point even more firmly to the existence of God and the reality of resurrection. Amen.
Yesterday, late morning, Paul and I had the privilege to be at the memorial service for Bishop Allen at All Saints, High Wycombe. It was a very beautiful service, and it was live streamed, but is still available to be watched. And I do encourage you, if you have an hour and a half, do watch it. It was very beautiful. Really got to the essence of who he was as a bishop, as a pastor, as somebody who worked right across Buckinghamshire and made all sorts of relationships, who he was as a dad, because one of his sons spoke as well. So, as I say, if you have the time, do watch it. Now I'm trying to think what's happening. Not sure whether anybody here would come. I did a bit of a cut and paste that didn't quite work about Derek Roxbury's funeral. So Derek was an 8 o'clocker. His funeral says on the update as being at 2 o'clock on Wednesday. It's not. It's at 11 o'clock. So thank you, Jennifer, for spotting that. 2 weeks' time, it's a 10 o'clock service, joint service. It's our APCM. So during that service, I'll be talking about what we have done, where we're heading, and then have a very, very short business meeting afterwards. So please do come along to that. There'll be copies of our annual report and then an annual review available, certainly some of that from next week. We need to elect, I'm not sure it's 3 or 4 people for PCC. So if anybody feels that they would be happy to do that, then please come and speak to me. We also need a treasurer. I said this last week. Matt has come to the point where he is standing down after 6 years of doing that role, and we desperately need somebody to replace him. So again, if you have any ideas or you feel that could be you, then please come and talk to me afterwards. On the 28th as well, in the afternoon, there will be a church walk to be able to go and see bluebells, although I think bluebells are around already at the moment. But Michael, who's in the music group, will be leading that. Sparklers starts tomorrow, so if you help at Sparklers, do come along for that.